Welcome to CyberLaw Now. It's a podcast where technology meets consumer rights, the law, and cybersecurity, hosted by renowned attorney Steven Teppler.
Online privacy. Is there really such a thing in today's everything goes and gets posted digital world? Is privacy good or bad? And who's it for? When did we even start being concerned with privacy? What laws, if any, protect our privacy? What laws take it away? What about our kids? What about their privacy? What if I told you that the last federal law protecting people from cyber intrusion was passed in the 1980s, before there was even a formal internet? Or that the only federal child protection law is now 20 years old and hasn't even been updated? Or that our computerized election systems are still at risk? And that most of the laws passed since then protect companies, but not individuals? Or that companies want to keep you from suing them in court if they're responsible for privacy invasions or other cybercrimes? Well, it does sound paranoid, doesn't it? If you want to learn more about cyber protection, laws, and how they affect you and our nation, join me, Steven Teppler, on the CyberLaw Now podcast, where I'll be joined by retired special agent from the FBI, Lawrence Wolfenden. Let's take a short break and we will return.
Malicious software. The robots are coming.
They say we are not prepared.
Spying, snooping.
It's scary.
I'm attorney Steven Teppler, and welcome to the CyberLaw Now podcast. I chair the cybersecurity and privacy practice at the Mandelbaum Salzburg law firm. Here at CyberLaw Now, we discuss today's cybersecurity, look at the underlying legal issues, make you aware of them, how they affect you, and what you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones. We are absolutely thrilled to have as today's repeat guest, retired FBI Special Agent Lawrence Wolfenden, who is a privacy, cybersecurity, and cyber forensics expert at the Sylint Group in Sarasota, Florida. Lawrence, I know you've told us a little bit about what you do and why you're in this area in particular, but why don't you go into a little more detail about also why this area is of special interest to you?
Sure thing, Steve. So I am, one of the things that I do at Sylint is conduct PCI forensic investigations. So PCI, payment card industry, has a number of standards related to cybersecurity, all intended primarily to keep your payment card data, that is your credit cards for the most part, but debit cards as well, and to keep that information private and secure because of the financial impacts. The card brands, MasterCard, Discover, Visa, American Express, and they are interested in protecting that because, of course, they suffer a loss if your credit card information gets out and they end up having to make payments on the standards that they set forth that are intended to protect that information. Obviously, criminals are often trying to get in and steal that information. And so when that happens, a company may be required to bring in a PCI forensics investigator. That is a firm that has been approved by the payment card industry, the credit card brands, to actually go in and look and see why did a breach happen, to do the investigation to figure out what happened and what of the controls that are mandated by the PCI, what of those controls either weren't in place, and that's why the information got stolen.
When you say credit card brands, as an expert, you're so familiar with all of these terms and terminology that every now and then I'm going to stop you and ask you to translate it for the rest of us and let us know what that means. So when you say card brands, what does it mean?
Sure. No, the card brands are the major credit card companies: Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and JCB, which is from Japan. Those groups, those card they're the publishers of the credit cards that we all have, or most of us have in our wallets. They got together and they put together the PCI digital security standards, the PCI DSS. And it's just a long list of items that should be in place in order for a company to be considered to be keeping your credit card data secure so you can have faith that when you put your credit card information in to purchase something online from Amazon or Walmart or Target or Joe's Crab Shack or wherever it is you're purchasing something, that that data is secure, and that once your credit card is out there, it's not, or in that company's possession, that it's not going to get stolen, either as you're putting it in or while it's still sitting there being processed.
Wow. Well, we were involved on the plaintiff side in the Target data breach, and that was a mess. And there was tons of information that was, we call it exfiltrated, that was disclosed, credit card information, debit card information. It looks like everybody suffered from that, including Target. But with those PCI DSS standards, what happened at Target? I mean, those standards existed at the time Target was had that experienced that problem, didn't it?
They did, and that's the purpose of the PCI forensic investigation, is to go in and see what precisely happened. If you accept that the standards are intended to help and will help, and they will. I've seen them, and with my background and knowledge and experience in investigating criminal activity, the standards are pretty good. They're not 100%, but nothing is. And so the forensic investigation is to go through and look at what was going on in a company at the time. Were all the standards in place? And if they weren't all in place and weren't all functioning properly, was it one of those, the failure of one of those to be in place, that caused the breach? Or in some cases, you may find out that, geez, all the standards were in place, they were all functioning correctly, but there's just something missing. The breach happened anyway, at which point it's up to the payment card to say, hey, we need another control in here to prevent this particular problem from happening.
So is this one of the things that you found interesting enough to drive you into this field?
Absolutely. It's very similar to the types of investigations I did while I was with the FBI. In conducting a forensic examination, the PCI forensic examination, you have the credit card brands are saying, hey, we need to find the root cause for what happened, and dig and dig and dig until you actually find the truth. There are millions of dollars at stake in them putting out standards that prevent these things. Probably the most disappointing thing I've seen, though, is that in most cases, it's not the fact that there is some standard or control that is lacking. The PCI DSS, the standards, have included methods and techniques and controls that should be in place, and that if they were in place would have probably prevented the credit card thefts from occurring, the loss of credit card data. It's the fact that most companies, it appears to me, do simply just don't apply all the standards that are mandated. And granted, it is difficult to apply all the standards, but it is part of their contractual obligation to do so, and it's just simply good business practice to protect this data that that is sitting there, and that you've been entrusted to hold. And there are ways to be sure that you are compliant without going through the full cost of taking on all the standards yourself. You can offload some of that. So you can hire companies that will make sure that these standards are in place and that they will control and maintain the security of the credit card information.
Lawrence, let me ask you this. We've talked about fines and penalties from PCI, from the payment card industry, the oversight authority for debit and credit card management. But those are civil penalties. Are you aware of, or are there also potential criminal consequences that would affect the company that had the problem?
Well, I do know that there are statutory requirements. Most states, if not all states, have breach notification requirements that if people's personal data, PII, personally identifiable information, so that's name coupled with date of birth, social security number, address, driver's license number, phone number, credit card information. If that type of information is stolen from a company by virtue of a network breach, an intrusion, then there is an obligation to let the people whose data has been stolen to be aware of that. I'm not certain that there are criminal penalties for having the breach. I'm actually unaware of any criminal penalties for having a breach. I do know that there are civil penalties for not reporting the breach and not letting people know that the breach happened, not letting them know in a timely fashion. There is some leeway to allow for an investigation to be certain that a breach has happened. There's some leeway to allow criminal investigations to occur. But in general, you have to let people know that they've actually had a problem, and failure to do that can come with significant financial penalties.
And so, thanks for that. And so, here's from the legal vantage point, there are always unfair and deceptive practice acts, I guess, that can be brought against a company whose acts in derogation, in violation of their obligation to keep information safe is so egregious that it can actually be a public policy issue. It can endanger segments of the population, sufficient perhaps to even find criminal liability, such as I could use an analogy such as the toxic waters in Flint, for which there are criminal indictments now pending. These are typically brought by the states. I don't know whether there are any federal actions to that effect, but it is very possible that we might see in the future, and you're right, I haven't seen any criminal activity or criminal accusations made to date for data breaches such as Target or one of the other large retail organizations. When we return, we'll find out more about how we're dealing with privacy issues and how you can better protect yourself and your loved ones with retired FBI agent Lawrence Wolfenden of the Sylint Group from Sarasota, Florida. Welcome back to the CyberLaw Now podcast. I'm attorney Steven Teppler, and I am really excited to have retired FBI Special Agent Lawrence Wolfenden of the Sylint Group here on the podcast with me. Actually, the second of 3 podcasts on this series of privacy that CyberLaw Now is hosting. We're talking about privacy in the law and how it affects your everyday digital life. We've just spoken about credit cards, payment cards, and the effects on your privacy. And Lawrence was talking to us about how this has fueled his interest in this area. So, Lawrence, let's talk a little bit more about privacy issues and our personal or sensitive information, including financial and health information and all those types of data points that we would really not want to have broadcast on the little chyron on your television screen or on your TV monitor. What have you seen in your experience as existing and developing concerns?
Well, I would have to say that it's an interesting two sides to the coin. So if you're a private citizen going about your business and just living day to day, there are bits and pieces of personal information that are out and about that are available on the internet to at the world, anybody who's connected to the internet. I live in Florida. Grew up in Florida. Love it here. And one of the things I always liked about Florida is that there's a very strong public records laws, and it's called the Government in the Sunshine statutes. And Florida passed a number of laws that basically really opened up state and local government to public scrutiny. So pretty much any activity done by the government is available to the public to look at. Politicians can't meet without allowing the public to be there, press or private citizens. They have to make any records inside of the state and local government available to the public. And there's a few exceptions, so things like criminal investigations and other things that are considered particularly sensitive, some ongoing contract negotiations and things like that might be restricted from public view. But in general, anything that is a record that's held by the state of government is available to anybody in the state. And, that was great as, I was growing up. You could go down to the local courthouse and pull any information that you wanted, and they couldn't restrict you. But now all that information has been uploaded and made available through the internet, which again is great from the standpoint.
Digitized, hasn't it?
Yeah, digitized. Yeah, and in fact, I worked before I started with the FBI. I worked at the clerk of the court in my hometown, and they were going through the process of digitizing all of the records that the clerk of the court had maintained. We had a little stand there set up where they bring in the record book, set it down, take a picture, turn it into a JPEG, and save it, and then turn the page and do another. And it was a long-term manual process. That was in the early 90s. But, now it's great that I can get to that information from my house. I don't have to go down to the courthouse. I don't have to maybe drive across the county to where the county courthouse is. I can sit at my desk, at my computer, and pull down the information as I need it. But if I can do it, so can anybody in the state of Florida, and so can anybody in the U.S., and so can anybody in the world. It can pull down that information. And some of that information, I don't necessarily am not excited about it being available to everybody in the world, because some of that information includes information about my mortgage. It may include my signature on my mortgage, on my deed where I purchased my house. In many cases, especially older records, you often had to write down your Social Security number on those documents. And so now they're digitized. Nobody necessarily went through and struck out all of the little sundries that are in there, like your Social Security number, date of birth, other things like that. And so somebody sitting in Eastern Europe can look online, pick out Lawrence Wolfenden, find public information in the public records about me, every place I've lived, my potentially pull my signature, potentially figure out what bank I bank at by virtue of the fact that that's where I have a mortgage. Maybe get enough information that they could call up and imitate and use a social exploitation technique to con their way into having access to my bank account.
Lawrence, have you seen any examples or any evidence of what people call title fraud or mortgage fraud, where people will go in and take that record that's publicly available and forge a transfer of title, then take out a mortgage on it, let it default, and by the time it's found out, the criminal, the fraudster, has taken the money, and you have a foreclosure action knocking at your door?
I have not seen that one, but what I have seen are situations where somebody is able to look at somebody's mortgage. We worked a case like this with the Sylint Group. It was I can't remember if it was a bank or a credit union had hired us to come in and take a look. They'd had several people's accounts compromised and the money stolen from them. And it turned out that what had happened is that criminals had apparently looked in the public records, found people's mortgage documents, saw that they had a mortgage with this particular credit union, and as I think about it, it was a credit union. Saw that they had a mortgage with this credit union, assumed if they have a mortgage with a credit union, they probably also have a bank account with the credit union. They then searched through the publicly available records to come up with addresses, social security numbers, dates of birth, enough information about relatives that they were able to call in to the customer service people at the credit union and eventually be able to talk their way into having access, online access to these people's bank accounts. And then they siphoned the money out of them. And although, you're not able to go and necessarily show where the attacker went into the mortgage information or anything like that, it was kind of fun because I had the opportunity to, with that theory that that's how they did it, to go and poke around in the public records myself to show that each of the people that were compromised did in fact have these documents available online, and that for each of them, I was able to go and pull their personal identifiers from various places online. And the sad thing is all of it was free, and all of it took me about 45 minutes per person. And I'm not by any means an expert at digging up PII data on people through public records. There are people who are experts at that. They're called personally identifiable information. The name, social security number, address, all the bits and pieces of things that prove that you use to prove you are who you are. And there are people who are experts at that, and they're often criminals. They do it all day long, and so they get really, really good at it. I myself never really had to get into using the techniques that these people use, because if I needed to find information about a subject or a witness or somebody that we were doing an investigation on, I could look up in government databases to which I had authorized access. So driver's license records.
But that's legal.
But that was legal. Exactly.
But that's permitted by law.
Exactly. Yeah. You want your law enforcement people to be able to look and see, oh, does this guy have a valid driver's license?
Certainly. And there are a few advantages to an open records law. Many people would want to know if a registered sex offender is living nearby or is living in an area in which they plan to move, and they don't want their children anywhere near that person. And there may be other reasons as well. We've been to law school again, and we've also been to law enforcement school again. We've learned about credit card information being hijacked. We've learned about open records, public records being accessible, and the benefits and the disadvantages possibly. A little bit about title fraud, loan fraud, and how people can steal your bank accounts. And this has been our special privilege to have retired FBI Special Agent Lawrence Wolfenden of the Sylint Group with us today, and in our second of 3 series on the law and cybersecurity. We've learned a ton of stuff. We learned that the United States doesn't have explicit privacy statutes for Americans, but we're going to find out a little bit more about FOIA, or the Federal Freedom of Information Act, next time. And we're also going to learn a little bit about constitutional law and about how those amendments we call the Bill of Rights help determine how and what kind of privacy we have as Americans here in the United States. So there are legal protections that can help make you and your children more secure from bad actors and criminals. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for joining us today. I hope to have you back on CyberLaw, and in fact, I will in next time. And thank you, our listeners, for your interest. Don't forget to hit subscribe and get all of your podcasts from CyberLaw Now while you sleep. Share them with your friends even. If you have a cyberlaw subject you want to hear more about it, contact us. And join me and Lawrence Wolfenden next time for part 3 of Privacy Law on the CyberLaw Now podcast. Until next time, this is attorney Steven Teppler.